Welcome to Willow's Book Apothecary. I am the creatrix of this channel, Willow. It is Spooktober, my friends, and that means everything macabre and spooky, all of the haunts and scary stories. I am calling out to my true crime enthusiasts today as we discuss what I believe to be one of Michigan's most amazing murder stories. If you are interested in learning more about Michigan's Lizzie Borden, or you have had a psycho mother-in-law, such as myself, keep watching because this is gonna be good. All right, y'all. So the book that I am sharing with you today is To Hell I Must Go by Rod Sadler. I met Rod Sadler in 2020 at the Oddity Festival ran by Jen Carpenter in Charlotte, Michigan. For those of you that are not familiar with Jen Carpenter, she has her own spooky bookstore in Lansing, Michigan, and she also hosts the So Dead podcast. So Dead podcast is a podcast all about Michigan true crime. So she runs this festival every year. Psychics, witchy vendors, and all different Michigan authors. So while I was at this festival, I met Rod Sadler and I picked up a copy of all of his books. So he dives into all different Michigan true crime cases as a veteran police officer. So he really does a great job digging deep into all of the records and the facts. Truly, his writing is different than anything I've ever read within the true crime realm. So what is really cool about this book is that Rod Sadler, the author, was doing genealogy research, and his great-grandfather was also a police officer. And while he was learning more about his great-grandfather's genealogy, he came across a newspaper article about this woman right here, Martha Haney, and that led him on a 10-year research expedition where he learned more about this murder that no one seems to have heard about before, about Michigan's own Lizzie Borden. So let's swing into it. I'd like to set the stage for you. It is April 1897. A woman named Martha Haney, who is our murderess, is married to a man named Alfie. Martha and Alfie live in Williamston, Michigan. For those of you who are from the Mitten State, it is going to be right around here. Unfortunately for Martha, her mother-in-law also lives with her and her husband. So Martha spends her days with her mother-in-law, Mariah. Now, Mariah never liked Martha from the get-go, and Rod makes that abundantly clear within his writing. Now, spoiler alert, we will really never know what Mariah thought of Martha because Martha had enough of her mother-in-law's shit. This is where things start to get good. One day, while Alfie is at work, Mariah is tormenting her daughter-in-law, and her daughter-in-law decides that she's had enough, so what does she do? What any reasonable person would do. She grabs an axe from the backyard, she goes in the house, and she starts whacking at her mother-in-law. She ends up decapitating her mother-in-law and putting it on a serving platter on the dining room table for when her husband comes home. Then she drags her mother-in-law's headless body to the kitchen where she decides to set it and the house on fire. So Rod Sadler's great-grandfather was the lead sheriff in this case, so he gets very up close and personal about every step of this event, as well as 5 days following the murder. I really have a lot of respect for how this book was written because he includes a lot of historical documents in the pages, photographs, and he sets it up like a novel so you feel like you're there while you're reading it. Truly, the work that he has done here is incredible. So, what happens to Martha Haney after she decapitates her mother-in-law and serves her mother-in-law's head on a platter for her husband when he gets home from work? Well, she confesses to the murder. She says, yeah, I did it. It's important to note that back in the late 1800s, there had to be an inquisition made for a crime. Normally, this was done at a tavern or a bar where you just gather up 6 or 7 people and they just discuss what happened and they make a verdict from there. In this specific case, what they did was they gathered 6 people from around town and they brought them into the crime scene. Mind you, there's a charred body and a decapitated head sitting on the dining room table. And they have to decide whether or not Martha Haney committed this crime. As you can imagine, it did not take long for them to find her guilty. Martha ended up getting sent to the Michigan Home for the Dangerous and Criminally Insane in Ionia, Michigan. This was one of a few psychiatric hospitals in Michigan at the time. Following the murder, Alfie actually gained a lot of recognition within the state for everything that had gone down in his home. He had attracted the attention of a woman named Alice, and they ended up moving in together, but they were not married. The law found out about Alfie and Alice cohabitating together without being married, and they were actually both arrested and sentenced for about a year. When they both got out of jail, they ended up getting married. Unfortunately, his new wife passed away and he ended up living out the rest of his days in a poor house in Okemos, Michigan. So Alfie did not really live a good life. And to begin with, he really struggled. I mean, even when he was married to Martha, he was supporting her by just being a day-to-day laborer and just taking in what he can. They were really struggling. They were very poor. Shortly after Martha's incarceration at the asylum, she ended up passing away a few months later of tuberculosis. So things did not really go well for her either, as you can imagine. So those are the facts. Those are the things that Rod Sadler beautifully spells out in his book, To Hell I Must Go. I wanted to lay out the facts for the people who are just here for that, and now I want to kind of just talk about the story in general, because when I met Rod Sadler at this Oddity Festival, he was explaining to me this story, and when he explained it to me, I busted out laughing. I was like, oh my God, that's amazing. And he was like, and I was like, if you know, you know, right? There's nothing worse in this world than an angry mother-in-law, than a psycho mother-in-law. I literally cannot think of anything worse. From the sounds of it, Mariah Haney, the mother-in-law, was an old brute, you know? She spent her life working on a farm and she was not kind to her daughter-in-law, and to be stuck in that environment for, you know, days on end, I can see why she snapped. You know, she didn't have Reddit to where she could go on Just No Mother-in-Law and vent. Martha Haney was isolated, and alongside of that, her own mother had passed away. Her children got taken away from her when she was younger. She had an abusive marriage when she was 16 years old. The sad events in her life really were just piling up on top of this crazy nagging mother-in-law. Kind of sounds like she deserved it a little bit, you know? Not all heroes wear capes. That's where I'm coming from. Yeah, no mother-in-laws were harmed in the making of this video. Have you heard of this murder? Let me know in the comments below. Truly, I think you have to get pushed to a point by someone to snap like that. You have to get pushed to the point of absolute lunacy to grab an axe, walk into the house, and bash an 80-year-old woman, 80 or 85 years old, you know, until you decapitate her head. And then you're like, you know what? I think I'm gonna serve this to my husband for dinner. But first, I'm gonna burn the house down and burn the woman's body. Can you imagine what was going through that woman's mind? And then they also mentioned that she just changes into a new dress and acts all casual when the house starts smoking and people are running. They're like, hey, are you okay? And they're like, yeah, my mother-in-law's in there. And the community goes in and like, oh my God, what happened? And she's like, yeah, I did it. I'm a true crime enthusiast, so maybe I'm just getting off too hard on this, but to me, this is amazing. This is awesome. If you're looking for something a little bit more unorthodox, if you're a Michigander and you're all about true crime, I highly recommend this book. I know that you can find this at Jen Carpenter's bookstore, and I think it's in Rio Town at this point in Lansing. And I believe Rod Sadler has his books available on Amazon. If Martha Haney were still alive, you know, I would probably have to recommend Toxic In-Laws by Susan Forward to her. Unfortunately, I think it's a little bit too late for that, but I feel you, woman. I feel you. If you want to check out more of Rod Sadler's work, then I have a couple more book recommendations for you. These are all true crime books based in Michigan. We have A Slayer Waits. I have not read this book yet, but this is the true story of a Michigan double murder. And I'll just read you the back really quick. When the bodies of Howard and Mira Herrick were discovered hidden in their barn on a cool fall night in 1955, their neighbor suddenly realized the screams she had ignored 2 nights before were the screams of the retired chicken farmer and his wife as they were being viciously bludgeoned to death. 13 months after the murders, the killer was captured in Baltimore and quickly returned to Michigan. For the Herrick family, what should have been the end of a horrible nightmare was only the beginning. So that is A Slayer Waits by Rod Sadler. This one just came out. It is Killing Women by Rod Sadler. Now this is an interesting read. I haven't gotten all the way through it yet, but let me just read you this because this is actually relevant to today. Don Miller was quiet and reserved. As a former youth pastor, he seemed a devout Christian. No one would ever suspect that the recent graduate of Michigan State University of Criminal Justice was a serial killer. However, Miller was arrested for the attempted murder of 2 teenagers in 1978. Police quickly realized he was probably responsible for the disappearances of 4 women. Offered a still controversial plea bargain, he led police to the bodies of the missing women. Now, this is important, guys. Now, after 40 years in prison, Miller has served his time and is due to be released into an unsuspecting population. I'm actually considering making a video about this book because this man, Don Miller, was one of Michigan's serial killers, okay? And he ended up not getting life in prison because he agreed to tell the families where the bodies were buried to give them closure. And by doing that, he only got charged with certain crimes, and he ended up getting up for parole just this year in 2021. A serial killer would be walking the streets of Michigan. Since this book was published earlier this year, I believe that he was not released on parole. I believe that because Rod Sadler wrote this to spread awareness within the community to help people understand what happened in this crime and why we should be on the lookout to see what happens within this case. So this is still a book that is very relevant to today about Michigan serial killer. All in all, I enjoy Rod Sadler's books a lot. I have spoken to him, like I said, at Oddity Festival in Charlotte, Michigan, and I also attended one of his speaking events at one of my local libraries and asked him for some writing advice and research advice in terms of writing my own book. That's all I have for you today, Booktube. Until next week, stay spooky.